You're in the room, but you're not in the room. Someone's talking to you and you can hear the words technically, but the real you is somewhere behind your eyes, running a conversation that happened 3 days ago or rehearsing one that might happen tomorrow. Your body showed up. Your mind is in a different building entirely. And the strangest part isn't that this happens sometimes. It's that you can't remember the last time it didn't happen. The last time you were actually here, in your own life, without some part of you watching from the inside like a spectator behind glass. If that sounds familiar, you're not lazy, you're not broken, and you're not just a daydreamer who needs to try harder to pay attention. People whose inner worlds had grown so vast, so detailed, so consuming, that the outer world started to feel like the distraction rather than the other way around. And what he found wasn't a disorder. It was a specific psychological adaptation with a purpose so precise that once you understand it, the fact that you live inside your head stops being a problem to fix and starts being a signal to decode. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The inner world, that rich, complex, endlessly active space you've built inside yourself, wasn't just a refuge, it was a negotiation. A deal your psyche made a long time ago when the outer world proved itself to be too unpredictable, too painful, or too indifferent to be trusted. And that deal, the one that felt like survival when you were young, has become something else entirely now that you're older. Something that protects you and traps you in equal measure. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually understood about people who live more inside their heads than in the world around them. Why this pattern develops, what your psyche is actually doing when it pulls you inward, the hidden cost that almost no one talks about, and the one shift could turn an inner world from a prison back into what it was always supposed to be. Jung's framework for understanding this starts with something most people oversimplify. He observed that human beings orient their psychological energy in one of two primary directions: outward, toward the external world of people, events, and objects, or inward toward the internal world of thoughts, images, feelings, and meaning. He called these orientations extroversion and introversion, and most people stop there. They take an online quiz, get told they're an introvert, and figure that explains why they'd rather stay home on a Friday night. But Jung meant something far more radical than social preference. For Jung, introversion was a fundamental orientation of consciousness. It meant that your primary reality, the place where things feel most real, most vivid, most alive, was inside. The external world wasn't unreal to you, but it was secondary, filtered, muted compared to the intensity of what happened in your inner landscape. The introvert didn't just prefer quiet evenings. They experienced the inner world with a richness and depth that the outer world rarely matched. Jung recognized this as a legitimate way of being human. He never pathologized introversion. He saw it as one half of a necessary psychological spectrum. But he also noticed something that troubled him. Some of the people he worked with had crossed a line. They hadn't just oriented toward the inner world, they'd retreated into it. And the difference between orientation and retreat was the difference between a preference and a fortress. The people who'd retreated weren't choosing the inner world because it was richer. They were fleeing into it because the outer world had become unbearable. And once inside, they'd built such elaborate psychological architecture, mental narratives, imagined conversations, fantasy scenarios, endless analysis loops, that leaving felt not just undesirable, but impossible. Their inner world had become the only place they felt safe, competent, and real. And the outer world had become something they moved through on autopilot, barely present, always half somewhere else. Jung traced this retreat to specific early conditions. Not always dramatic trauma, though sometimes that was the catalyst. More often it was a subtler wound, environments where the child's inner experience was consistently ignored, dismissed, or punished. The child who shared their feelings and was told they were too sensitive. The child who expressed enthusiasm and was mocked. The child who reached outward for connection and found indifference, rejection, or volatility waiting for them. These children learned something their nervous systems never forgot. The outer world is not safe for the real you. Your thoughts, your feelings, your imagination, your actual experience, none of it is welcome out there. So you pull it all inside. You build rooms in your mind where your real self can exist undisturbed. And gradually, those inner rooms become more familiar, more comfortable, more home than anything outside ever was. Jung would have called this a compensatory withdrawal. The psyche, finding the outer world inhospitable to authentic expression, compensates by enriching the inner world until it becomes a complete alternative. And for a while, it works. The inner world provides what the outer world wouldn't: safety, control, depth, meaning. You can replay conversations and give yourself the words you couldn't find in real time. You can imagine scenarios where you're understood, valued, seen. You can process emotions at your own pace instead of being ambushed by them in public. But compensation always has a cost. And the cost of living primarily inside your head is one that accumulates so gradually you might not notice it until you're standing in the middle of your actual life, wondering why it feels like it belongs to someone else. The first cost is the atrophy of the outer life. When you invest most of your psychological energy in the inner world, the outer world doesn't just feel less vivid, it actually becomes less developed. Relationships stay shallow because you're not fully present in them. Skills don't mature because you're rehearsing mastery in your imagination instead of fumbling through it in practice. Experiences pass through you without leaving much trace because your attention was elsewhere when they happened. You end up with a strange imbalance, an incredibly rich, sophisticated inner world paired with an outer life that feels thin, underdeveloped, almost accidental, and the gap between the two starts to hurt. Because inside your head, you're articulate, capable, interesting. You have insights and ideas and emotional depth that would stun people if they could see it. But outside your head, in the actual world where things happen and count, you feel awkward, behind, like you're watching everyone else participate in a game whose rules you never quite learned. This gap isn't evidence that you're defective. It's the natural result of decades of investment flowing in one direction. You built an extraordinary interior and left the exterior largely unattended. That's not a character flaw. That's a survival strategy that worked too well. The second cost is harder to see because it disguises itself as something productive. Jung noticed that people who lived primarily in their heads often mistook thinking about life for living it. They'd process an experience so thoroughly in their minds that they felt as though they'd already had it. They'd rehearse a conversation so many times that having the actual conversation felt redundant. They'd analyze a decision from every angle until the act of deciding felt unnecessary, because the analysis had already provided a sense of completion. Jung saw this as a kind of psychological counterfeit. The inner world was producing convincing simulations of experience, and the psyche was accepting those simulations as real. You feel like you've dealt with something because you thought about it for hours. You feel like you've connected with someone because you imagined the connection in detail. You feel like you've taken action because you planned the action so thoroughly that the planning itself felt like accomplishment. But none of it happened. The conversation never took place. The decision was never made. The experience was never had. And the outer life remains exactly where it was, while the inner world generates an increasingly convincing illusion of progress. This is where Jung's framework becomes crucial, because he recognized that the inner world isn't the problem. Living inside your head isn't inherently destructive. The destruction happens when the inner world replaces the outer world instead of enriching it, when thinking becomes a substitute for doing, when imagining becomes a substitute for experiencing, when the glass between you and your life stops being something you occasionally notice and starts being something you can't find the edges of anymore. And if you've been living this way for years, maybe decades, there's something you need to hear. The reason you can't stop retreating inward isn't weakness or laziness or lack of discipline. It's because something in the outer world still feels fundamentally unsafe to you, and your psyche is still running the protection program it installed when you were young. You're not choosing to live in your head, you're being pulled there by a mechanism that once saved you from something real. Jung found that the retreat inward almost always protected the individual from a specific kind of pain. Not physical danger usually, something more psychological. The pain of being truly seen and rejected. The pain of wanting something and failing publicly. the pain of being emotionally present in a world that demonstrated over and over that your presence wasn't valued or was actively punished. So the psyche built a workaround. You can be fully present inside. You can want things inside. You can be seen inside, by yourself, in your own inner theater. And none of it carries the risk that the outer world carries. Inside your head, you can't be humiliated. You can't be abandoned. You can't reach for something and have it slapped away. The inner world is sovereign territory. No one else has access unless you grant it. And for someone whose early experience taught them that access equals danger, that sovereignty feels like oxygen. If you've been doing inner work of any kind, journaling, reflection, trying to understand your own patterns, and you recognize what we've been talking about here, you might find something helpful in what we've put together. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jungian thought, designed not to pull you out of your inner world, but to help you use it the way Jung intended, as a bridge, not a bunker. Click below to explore it. Here's where Jung's understanding deepens into something most people never hear. He didn't believe the solution was simply forcing yourself outward. He'd watched too many patients try that, pushing themselves into social situations, forcing action, white-knuckling their way through presence. And it didn't hold. Because the underlying program hadn't changed. The psyche still believed the outer world was hostile to the real self. All the forced participation in the world accomplished was exhaustion without transformation. What Jung proposed instead was something more elegant and more demanding. He believed the inner world needed to be used differently, not abandoned, not escaped from, not suppressed in favor of outer engagement. The inner world needed to become conscious rather than automatic, and there's a massive difference between those two states that most people who live in their heads have never been shown. When the retreat inward is automatic, when you dissociate into thought without choosing to, when you find yourself in a mental loop without knowing how you got there, when hours disappear into internal processing you didn't initiate, the inner world is running you. You're not exploring your psyche. Your psyche is consuming your attention as a defense mechanism. The richness of your inner world isn't a sign of depth in those moments. It's a sign that your nervous system has detected something threatening in the present moment and has pulled you inside for safety. Jung wanted people to notice the difference. When are you going inward by choice, with awareness, to do genuine psychological work? And when are you being pulled inward by an old program that doesn't trust the present moment to be survivable? That distinction changes everything. Because once you can see the mechanism, you stop identifying with it. You stop saying, "I'm just someone who lives in my head," as though it's a permanent trait, and you start noticing, "My psyche just pulled me inside. What was happening in the outer world that triggered the retreat?" And when you start asking that question honestly, the answers are almost always painful. You were pulled inward because someone looked at you and you felt exposed. Because a conversation required emotional vulnerability and your system redirected you to analysis instead of feeling. Because something in the present moment asked you to be real, to be here, to be visible, and the old wound said no, not safe, go inside. Jung described a practice he called active imagination, which was his method for engaging the inner world consciously rather than being passively consumed by it. Active imagination wasn't daydreaming. It wasn't rumination. It wasn't the mental loops that eat your afternoons. It was a deliberate, structured engagement with the images and figures that arose from the unconscious, treating them as real psychological entities, entering into dialogue with them, listening to what they had to say rather than simply being swept along by the currents they created. The difference is the difference between drowning in a river and navigating it. The river is the same. The inner world is the same. But your relationship to it has fundamentally shifted. You're no longer passive material being shaped by unconscious forces. You're a conscious participant in your own inner landscape. And that participation changes what the inner world can offer you. When people who live in their heads learn to engage their inner world through active imagination rather than automatic retreat, something remarkable happens. The inner world stops being an escape from reality and starts being preparation for it. Insights that used to circle endlessly without resolution begin to crystallize into understanding you can act on. Emotions that used to stay abstract and intellectual begin to connect to your body and your actual circumstances. The gap between your inner richness and your outer thinness begins to close. Not because you've abandoned the inside, but because you've learned to carry what you find there back out into the world. This was the function the inner world was always supposed to serve. It was never meant to be a permanent residence. It was meant to be a workshop, a place where you process, integrate, understand, and then return to the outer world changed by what you've discovered. The introvert's gift, in Jung's view, wasn't the ability to live inside themselves. It was the ability to bring depth to everything they touched, because their inner processing enriched their engagement rather than replacing it. But that gift only activates when the bridge between inner and outer stays open, when the traffic flows both ways, when you go inward to understand and then come back outward to live what you've understood. The moment the inner world becomes a one-way street, all inflow, no outflow, the gift becomes a wound, and the wound becomes a lifestyle. And the lifestyle becomes so familiar that you forget there was ever another way to inhabit your own existence. There's another layer to this that Jung found particularly important, and it has to do with what you're actually avoiding by staying inside your head. Not the obvious things, social anxiety, vulnerability, rejection. Those are real, but they're the surface. Underneath the avoidance of the outer world, Jung consistently found an avoidance of something internal, something that the inner world itself was designed to keep you away from. This sounds paradoxical. You retreat into your mind, and the retreat itself is a way of avoiding something in your mind? Jung understood the psyche as layered, with the conscious inner world, the one you inhabit, the thoughts you think, the narratives you run, serving as a kind of lobby for the unconscious, which holds everything you've refused to face. The mental loops, the endless analysis, the rehearsed conversations, they're not just alternatives to outer experience, they're alternatives to deeper inner experience. They keep you busy on the surface of your psyche so you never have to descend into what's underneath. What's underneath is usually grief. Grief for the childhood where you couldn't be yourself. Grief for the years spent behind glass while life happened on the other side. Grief for the connections you wanted but couldn't risk. Grief for the version of yourself that might have existed if the outer world had been safe enough to meet you. That grief is enormous, and it sits beneath the constant mental activity like bedrock beneath a busy city. The city never stops humming specifically so you never have to feel the ground. Accessing this grief, not thinking about it but actually feeling it, was the turning point. The moment someone stopped analyzing why they retreated and actually let themselves feel the loss that the retreat was designed to prevent. That feeling was what the psyche had been working so hard to avoid. And feeling it, while devastating, was also the thing that began to dissolve the glass. Because the glass isn't really between you and the outer world. The glass is between you and your own unlived life. Between you and the grief of having spent so long watching instead of participating. Between you and the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of actually being here, in your body, in the room, in the conversation, without a mental escape hatch ready to pull you out the moment things get too real. Jung watched people go through this process. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. It didn't look like a breakthrough followed by a permanently changed life. It looked like someone gradually, painfully, learning to stay in the room a little longer each time. Noticing when their mind pulled them inward, and gently choosing to remain present for another 30 seconds, another minute, another breath. Not forcing, not performing presence for someone else's benefit, just quietly practicing the radical act of being where they actually were. And over time, something shifted. The outer world, which had always felt muted and distant compared to the vividness inside, started to develop color. Conversations that used to feel like obligations started to carry actual weight. The feeling of sunlight, of a voice, of someone's eyes meeting theirs. These sensations, which had been dampened for years by the constant pull inward, began to register again. Not because the person had abandoned their inner world, because they'd stopped using it as a hiding place and started using it as Jung intended, as a depth that enriches presence rather than replaces it. This is the part that's hardest to convey to someone who's lived inside their head for a long time. The outer world isn't as thin as it seems to you. It seems thin because you've been experiencing it through layers of mental processing that buffer you from direct contact. You're not actually experiencing the conversation. You're experiencing your thoughts about the conversation. You're not feeling the moment. You're narrating the moment to yourself internally while the moment passes by unmet. Strip away the narration, even briefly, even imperfectly, and the outer world turns out to be as vivid and complex as anything you've ever built inside. Maybe more so, because it's not under your control. It surprises you. It offers things your imagination never would have generated because it operates beyond the boundaries of your own psyche. And that unpredictability, which your wounded system interprets as threat, is actually the thing that makes outer experience irreplaceable. Your inner world can give you depth, meaning, processing, integration, but it can't give you the shock of the genuinely new. Only contact with what's outside you can do that. Jung would never have told you to leave your inner world behind. That would be asking you to amputate the very thing that makes you psychologically unusual. The depth of your inner life isn't a problem to solve, it's a capacity to honor. But capacity becomes pathology when it operates unconsciously, automatically, as a defense mechanism you never chose and can't seem to stop. The shift isn't from inner to outer. It's from unconscious retreat to conscious choice. From being pulled behind the glass without realizing it, to noticing the glass and choosing, in small moments, to step through it. From using your inner world to avoid living, to using it to deepen the living you're actually doing. You might be wondering what this looks like in practice. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like catching yourself mid-dissociation during a conversation and choosing to make eye contact instead of retreating further into your head. It looks like noticing that you've been rehearsing tomorrow's interaction for 45 minutes and gently redirecting your attention to the actual room you're sitting in. It looks like feeling the grief rise when you're present, the grief of all the years you weren't, and letting it be there instead of burying it under another round of analysis. It looks like imperfect, stuttering, uncomfortable attempts to be where you are, and it feels terrible at first. Because the outer world without the buffer of constant mental processing is overwhelming. It's loud. It's unpredictable. It asks things of you that your inner world never did. Spontaneity, vulnerability, the willingness to not know what happens next. Your system will scream at you to go back inside where it's safe, and sometimes you will. That's not failure. That's the oscillation Jung expected. The bridge between inner and outer isn't built in a day. It's built in thousands of small moments where you choose presence over retreat, even when presence is harder. What Jung ultimately understood about people who live inside their heads is that they're not deficient in some outer world skill. They're not missing a piece that extroverts have. They're carrying an extraordinary inner capacity that got conscripted into service as a defense mechanism before they were old enough to use it any other way. The inner world wasn't supposed to be a fortress. It was supposed to be a well, somewhere you go to draw depth and then bring it back to the surface where it can nourish the life you're actually living. You have that well. You've always had it. Most people don't have anything close to the inner richness you carry. But you've been living at the bottom of it instead of drawing from it. And the difference between those two ways of relating to your own depth is the difference between a life observed from behind glass and a life inhabited fully, with all the discomfort and unpredictability and raw beauty that comes with being genuinely here. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to extinguish the inner world or force yourself into an outer life that feels foreign. You need to open the bridge, to let traffic flow both ways, to bring what you discover inside back out into the room, the relationship, the moment that's waiting for you right now while your mind tries to pull you somewhere else. Jung spent his own life navigating this tension. His inner world was so vast that he nearly lost himself in it during the years he documented in the Red Book. He knew what it was like to be more present in imagination than in his own living room. And what he learned, what saved him, wasn't the rejection of the inner world. It was the discipline of returning from it, going deep, finding what was there, and then coming back, every time. Not because the outer world was better, but because the outer world was where the inner world's treasures became real. That's what's waiting for you on the other side of the glass. Not a world that's louder or more demanding than what you can handle. A world that's been waiting for you to bring to it the depth you've been hoarding inside. The conversations that get your full presence instead of your autopilot. The experiences that land in your body instead of being rerouted to your mind. The grief you've been circling for years, finally allowed to arrive and do the transformative work that only felt emotions can do. The glass can dissolve, not all at once, not through force or willpower or some sudden breakthrough. Through the slow, repeated, unglamorous act of noticing when you've left and choosing to come back. That's all. That's the whole practice. And it's enough. Because every time you choose the room over the retreat, the bridge between your inner world and your outer life gets a little stronger. And eventually, you stop living behind your eyes and start living through them. If you haven't explored it yet, our guide True Self-Discovery offers 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's work, built for people who know their inner world intimately, but haven't yet learned to let it change the life they're actually living. Click below to find it.